Okay, yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me. I'm really very honored and happy to be here. I mean, to Copenhagen, where I have last been as a teenager, and also to talk about a topic that I'm very passionate about. And yeah, Jörn asked me to briefly introduce myself. So I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Zurich and at the history department, but not a historian by training. And I'm also a lecturer associated with the ISAC Anthropology department in Zurich. And my background is actually in social anthropology and China studies, or Chinese studies. And I did my PhD at the University of Zurich also after I had graduated in Berlin and studied in Berlin and Shanghai and Rome, Chinese studies and anthropology. And yeah, so what I'm presenting today is part from my completed PhD research and also my book that I made out of that research that was funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. And yeah, currently I'm working also on quite a different topic on digital infrastructures and Sino-Swiss relations in this field. And at the same time, I'm also a convener of the German Anthropological Association China Regional Group. Okay, so much about myself. So I start with my talk that has 4 main parts, and I start with the introduction, and I begin this talk on rural China with a scene from urban China, which is actually where my research and where my engagement with rural China began, and actually from an interest in rural migrant workers in the city. So this is what you see here is a small street restaurant in the middle where the woman is standing. And in 2008 in Shanghai, selling a spicy noodle soup called malatang. And yeah, that was at the outskirts of the former French concession. And I got to know the family working in that restaurant very closely. I call them the Wu family. And they turned out to be migrant workers from Anhui province. And they actually had a background in rice farming, but they had been in Shanghai for 8 years already at that time, and also migrated to other places before. And they had left their children and also their elderly relatives behind in the countryside. And at that time, mobile phones were not so common yet, so they called them only once a week from a telephone booth and really missed them dearly, and only saw them once a year during the Chinese New Year celebrations. And during one of these celebrations in 2008, they took me home with them together. And what really struck me then was that they were maintaining their rice fields. So rather than just letting the fields lay fallow during their absence, I saw neatly cultivated and harvested rice fields, and that really struck me. So yes, so I switch to another scene that is about 2 years later in 2010, and that is the same area. And at that time, the whole block was about to disappear. Mr. Wu then relied on the support of his fellow villagers in the city and some extended family members. And Mrs. Wu, she returned home to take up rice farming again for several years, actually. And there are really many cases like this of migrant workers encountering adversities in the city and who then have to go home and rely on their field resources again. Yeah, and so the fields are really a very important safety net for rural migrant workers, and a lot of strategic efforts are made to preserve them in this migration context, and what I'm going to talk about today. So in talking about this topic, I bring into conversation the anthropology of migration, of agriculture, and of technology, and I argue that paddy fields really play a very crucial role in migration processes, and that generally we need to pay more attention to the material world of migration and related knowledge and skills. So my research draws on 19-month, non-consecutive months of ethnographic fieldwork between 2000 and 2011, and then also follow-up interviews until 2017. First in urban Shanghai, then in rural Anhui, and then later in Hunan province in Anren County, which is in Zhengzhou, which is the white dot on the map, and which is where most of my talk takes place. But I also draw on local gazetteers, on yearbooks, and some statistics. And after Sichuan province, Anhui and Hunan are the second and third largest sending provinces for rural urban migrants in China. And they're also major rice growing areas, especially Hunan, where they usually have 2 rice harvests a year. So on a national scale, since the 1980s, over 1/4 of the Chinese, or entire Chinese population, according to official numbers, has migrated, or more than 1/3 of Chinese farmers, and mostly to the big cities on the Chinese east coast, which you see here also. So that means that actually, on average, every rural household has at least 1 migrant members. Usually it's the middle generation that migrates, and the ones, we heard that right now already, the ones who stay behind are then often children, women, and especially the elderly and sick people. But then the question is, what does this actually mean for agriculture if so many people are leaving the countryside? And how do rural households see the situation and cope with it? But let me first turn a little bit to the broader policy context and also the farming context, and to what I call the farming migration predicament before I present some concrete strategies. So on the one hand of the predicament, there is the pressure for field protection, because with decollectivization in the 1980s, farmland has been contracted to individual households, as we also heard already right now. And so land ever since then has really become an important social security aspect for farmers, especially in view of the dismantling of the communes and also the abolishment of the collective welfare system. So like in the case of the Wu family. But then wet rice fields in particular have this special characteristics that they need to be cultivated continuously in order to preserve the soil quality and value, and also to prevent tenacious weeds, which then would be harmful for rice cultivation. And to do so really requires sufficient labor input. But then this is not so easy in view of the other side of the predicament, which is migration pressure. And here, since the 1980s reform policies, for the first time in decades, farmers have been allowed to migrate to the cities. But at the same time, what is commonly quite overlooked is that labor-saving technologies in farming has also contributed to setting free millions of farmers from their land and reinforcing this push for migration. So there are considerable social and financial pressures to migrate, but then also due to the hukou system, or what is left of it, migrants only usually have temporary rights to stay in the city and to access the better urban welfare and education system. So to exemplify this pressure, here are 2 quotes this time from people from Hunan. This is a man I call Farmer Joe, and he says, well, from rice farming alone, a household can earn about 10,000 yuan per year. And from this, you have to subtract the cost for pesticides, harvesting, and fertilizer. You cannot send your children to university with these few thousand yuan per year. But you can earn between 1,000 and 2,000 yuan as a construction worker. that is up to 3 times as much as a rice farming household. And this is from 2011, so the incomes have risen since then, but so have also the consumption and the expenditures. So the situation is still a little bit similar. Or his daughter, for example, that I call Yume, says, "My brother is 22 now and will have to marry soon, but he works in mining, so it is difficult for him to get to know a woman there. He needs a piece of land and to build a house, otherwise it will be hard for him to find a wife." So earning money for education or for marriage creates a lot of pressure then to migrate. So coming back to the predicament, and on the one hand, farmers need to protect their fields as a safety net through constant cultivation, which requires a certain number of people. But on the other hand, then they feel pushed to leave the countryside, which makes it difficult to care for the fields. And scholars from various disciplines have repeatedly stressed that fields really play a crucial role in and for migration. But the specific socio-technical challenges in preserving this key asset, and also the knowledge needed to do so, they have remained largely unexplored. So this is what I do in my book, part of which I present today. And here I ask in this book, so what are then the challenges for preserving fields in this context of predicament? And what knowledge is needed to do so? And how do farmers strategically cope with the predicament? Regarding then the knowledge aspect, so here's my oversimplified overview of the Chinese system of rice knowledge transmission, where I draw horizontally on the anthropologist Frederick Barth, and who set up a model of knowledge transmission, dividing knowledge transmission into 3 interrelated aspects that are corpus, media, and social organization. And vertically, I apply that to the Chinese system, and I divide that system into 3 periods. That is the pre-collectivization system, where farmers had mainly manual knowledge and transmitted in households and lineages and along specific gender patterns. Then you have the collective system, which was marked by the key moment of the Chinese Green Revolution, which actually occurred also not coincidentally at the same time as the Cultural Revolution, which is much better known in Western scholarship, and which included state-supported new cultivation patterns, new varieties, improved irrigation, farm chemicals, and also mechanization, so a major industrialization of farming. And this still continues to have effects today as farmers still use these technologies in the post-reform system of knowledge transmission. But today we have a situation in which farming knowledge is increasingly getting lost in the young migrant generation. But at the same time, if we look at the overall village society, then we can actually say that farmers can at least potentially access a whole repertoire of knowledge and technologies and techniques ranging from, both manual and industrial ones, and they do so to deal with their predicament. And many of these strategies then may seem new in the reform era, but they actually have also historical roots. But let's look now how farmers use their available knowledge from that system, and also the technologies to cope with their predicament and also with their land. So in my book, I describe 12 different land use and land arrangement strategies, and I apply that widely here, that concept of land use, including some social strategies, not only technical ones. And I won't go through all of them here, but what is important to note is that part of them sustain intensive rice cultivation, like leaving behind family members, renting out the fields, seasonal return, mutual help, hiring labor, using labor-saving technologies, or direct seeding. And these are generally encouraged by the Chinese government because rice cultivation continues despite migration. But others, they imply a de-intensification of rice farming, such as switching from 2 to only 1 rice crop a year, actually abandoning the fields altogether, or constructing houses on the field, and also switching to dry fields, which implies that you cannot easily reuse them for planting rice again afterwards, and also switching to planting cash crops instead of rice. And these strategies are either forbidden or there is some difference between the central and local government aims. So some of them are tolerated by local governments because they create some tax revenues, for example, but they stand in contrast to the national goal of grain sufficiency. And today I will talk about 3 of these strategies, which are labor-saving technologies, direct seeding, and cash crops, to give some insights into that. And my basic argument here in looking at these strategies is that in taking these land use decisions, farmers are actually pursuing larger projects. So projects that are not only technical, but also social. And this may imply, for example, generally the preservation of the paddy field resource, then finding a marriage partner, security in old age, or continuing the patry line, the children's education, safeguarding their own health, or getting the best out of both the rural and the urban world. And maybe not every aspect of this will become clear now from the 3 examples that I present, but I think the overall argument that these land use decisions are not only technical is nevertheless clear. So my first example is labor-saving technologies, which implies maintaining intensive rice farming. And this is a very common strategy. And this includes, for example, mechanization, very importantly, but also technologies such as farm chemicals that also save labor, or very other technologies such as, for example, building cement ridges between the fields so farmers save the labor from cutting the grass on these ridges, or more unexpected technologies like that. And what you see here is 2 graphs based on the 2021 China Statistical Yearbook. The one is about agricultural machinery and the other one about consumption of chemical fertilizers between the period of 1978 and 2020. And you see that they have risen extremely. And these technologies actually have a very close but also complex relationship to migration. And it's very interesting to see them in relation also to migration. And here's another graph that is on the official number of domestic migrants during roughly the same period. And it's, of course, very tempting here due to the similarities in these curves to see some direct correlations here, but obviously there are many factors that play into this, and reality is more complex. So I'm not an economist also, but what I can say based on my ethnographic fieldwork is that there is indeed a very close relationship between labor-saving technologies and migration, and I would suggest a multi-causal relationship. And it's interesting in particular to look at the relationship between mechanization and migration. For example, the case of harvesting and threshing. So here you see the conventional implement for harvesting, that is sickles, and on the other picture, the only combine harvester in the village at the time of my stay. In Anren County, where I did that field research, mechanization began in the 1950s, so quite almost right after the establishment of the People's Republic, when the local government introduced the first machines there to the county, and including for threshing grain. And at the same time, the People's Liberation Army also introduced electricity to the county seat when they established a rice mill there. But the first combine harvester, similar to this one, was only introduced in the late 1990s, but at that time also through a local government initiative. But this one is owned by a private farmer, by the richest farmer in the village. And yeah, he had saved up 8 years, he said, in order to, with his whole family, in order to afford this one. But when combine harvesters were first introduced in the 1990s, it is reported that 3,000 farmers gathered to watch that spectacle of that exciting new vehicle that could both harvest and thresh at once and save a lot of labor. But there are state subventions for these machineries, but and the local and also central governments have really played a crucial role in disseminating such technologies. But like I said, only the richest farmers can actually afford these. And the other one, if they have sufficient funds, they can rent these services. Yeah, so alongside other rural policies and also a general increase in the rural population in that period, these labor-saving technologies have contributed in Anren in particular to releasing half of the rural labor force by the mid-1990s. So in the first moment, these machines contributed to inducing farmers to migrate. But then in the decades that followed, the relationship became more complex because farmers also then, in my interviews, they began to adopt mechanization strategically in order to cope with the lacking labor. And yeah, also what is very important, that through migrant labor, they eventually also had the necessary funds to pay for these machines. And so there's a very close relationship. So I present you one example. This is Mrs. Law, I call her, a left-behind woman who hosted me during my stay in the village. And here you see her harvesting rapeseed that grows on a rice field. And her husband, who I quoted earlier, he had migrated in the early 1990s. So he was among rather the first generation of migrant workers to become a construction worker in order to finance the education of his 3 children. The eldest child then managed actually to study hard and to get a university degree in Beijing. And with that, she managed to finance the vocational training of her younger siblings. And also, she regularly sent home money to her mother, which the mother, Mrs. Law, then used also to invested that in mechanization. And Mrs. Law herself, she only left the countryside once because she wasn't in a good health shape. And when she was in the city, she didn't feel comfortable, and she attributed that to her body not being used to city life. So she returned, and ever since has been the only one staying home, taking care of the fields. And she continued to use some manual techniques, also some sickles, but she also generally welcomed mechanization because she said it's much quicker. So for example, plowing and harvesting, machine plowing and harvesting enabled her to continue rice cultivation despite the missing household labor. But her choice was actually not that simple. I mean, obviously a combine harvester is much faster and saves a lot of labor and is also, like I said, very expensive. So these are very obvious factors to take into account. But there are also other factors that farmers need to take into account. For example, that combine harvesters leave behind very long bushels of rice straw on the field, which is then simply burned. And I mean, this has bad environmental consequences, or it also means that amphibians like frogs may die that had been key to pest management before. And also this rice straw, because the sickle is actually an implement that allows harvesting not only the grains, but also the straw. And that straw used to be used in a lot of everyday activities, from cooking to sleeping to feeding drought animals. So it has a lot of effects on this whole socio-technical system of farming if you suddenly switch one technology within that whole system. So that were all factors that Mrs. Law had to take into account when making her technological choices. And then she actually used both. She used a combine harvester in some parts of her field and a sickle in some other parts of the field. And she rented the services of a combine harvester from a fellow villager. And at that time, in 2011, this cost 100 yuan per mu, which was at that time still very expensive. And some farmers were not willing or able to afford that. And she could also only do that through the migrant income of her family members. But by using then this combine harvester or the services of that, she was able to safeguard the family's rice fields while also protecting her own health and easing the double burden of caring for the fields and then later also of the grandchildren. And by financing machine harvesting, the migrated family members, they also pursued their own projects. Like, of course, the long-term project of preserving the field from afar, but also more short-term projects like acquiring further education or vocational training, or in the case of Mrs. Law's son, to earn enough money to build a house in order to being able to find a wife and marry. And yeah, this has been successful. I mean, currently Mrs. Law's taking care of 3 grandchildren. So yes, but while this strategy of mechanization is quite obvious actually in a migration context, and it also fits very well into Chinese modernization discourses, there are some other cases where farmers also deliberately choose to revert to older manual techniques. Like in my second example, that is direct seeding. So usually rice is first grown in a seed bed and then it is transplanted into a proper rice field. I mean, what you see on the first picture and Mrs. Law in the green pullover in the middle. And this needs a lot of labor to do that, the transplanting. It's one of the peak seasons along with harvesting and rice farming. But it also has a lot of advantages to do that, like making use of scarce water, land, fertilizer, being able to control weeds effectively, and also gaining higher yields generally. But then in the 2010s, I suddenly found that some farmers had stopped transplanting. And instead of using machines, transplanting machines, I mean, which also exists in some part of China, they actually began then to broadcast the seeds directly into the field, which was then much less work to do that, but also they had much more weeds, and it was also much more expensive because you need more seeds than when you do that, and also certain types of seeds that are suitable for that. So that also needs to be evaluated if it's worth making that switch. But I find it very interesting because this case, I mean, direct seeding was actually the earliest rice cultivation method in China, which used to be practiced more than 2 millennia ago in the late Han Dynasty. And then suddenly, it's quite remarkable that farmers in a way still have preserved that knowledge and that it comes up again now in a migration context. So coming back to Mrs. Lohr in 2016, direct seeding for her meant that, quote, that work is not so bitter, but relaxed. And also people do that, she said, because households don't have time. 家里没时间, like, I mean, due to migration. So she herself then also did both. Adapting that to the household circumstances. So she took up transplanting again when her husband returned temporarily and to build a new house for the son. But meanwhile, direct seeding was an option as long as she was home alone to compensate for the missing labor, but also to act again in view of her own health and still to continue some rice to protect this field resource for the family. And in doing so, she was also enabling the other family members to migrate and to be productive and also to be reproductive. Yeah, but if you remember now the overview of the 12 strategies that I showed you, so these two I presented now, labor-saving technologies and direct seeding, they enable farmers to more or less keep up intensive rice farming. But the next one, that is switching to cash crops, not necessarily. But plant choice is, as many scholars have shown, is really actually also a very complex issue because it's really related to numerous factors which type of plant farmers choose to plant. It's related to natural and to technical issues, but it's also cultural, social, and symbolic, the choice taken. And also here, here on this image, you see rice fields in front of the village. So in this migration context, it's also a social choice to do that. During the collective period, the main government focus was on intensifying rice production as much as possible. But then with the return to household farming in the 1980s, farmers have increasingly turned to diversifying their crops. And here it is very notable that if you look at the statistics at the area sown with rice here between 1978 and 2020, this area has actually decreased by more than 12%. And if you look at the area sown with cash crops, like for example, peanuts, rapeseed, tobacco, fruit, vegetables, and tea, most of these have grown significantly. And wheat also has decreased even more than rice, and corn or maize has actually increased. Yeah, but as a side note, maybe we would expect that farmers have less rice to eat, but this is not the case because rice outputs have actually more than doubled in the same period, mainly due to new rice varieties and to new technological inputs. And this is also why, so farmers plant less rice, but they harvest more. And this is why the government also, I found, usually does not respond with punishing farmers when they de-intensify rice farming, at least in my field sites in Hunan. But they respond with trying to introduce ever new technologies to solve this problem, and so far quite successfully from the point of view of output. And returning to this strategy of cash crops. So there have been many reports in the literature of local officials that have been promoting or even forcing villagers to plant certain cash crops, like tobacco, for example, in some areas of China, because they get higher tax revenues from that, which then stands in contrast to the national goal of grain self-sufficiency. But in Anren County, where I did my research, I found that planting cash crops was often also the villagers' own choice. So here I present you one cash crop. I mean, the most important cash crop in Anren County is rapeseed, but I find it very interesting to look at a very local cash crop, which is lampreash or dongxincao. And this grows in the winter and in the spring, so it replaces the early rice crop. And as its name, both in English and also in Chinese, suggests, this crop was previously used for lighting. And it was already a major local cash crop in Qing and Republican China. But then, due to its perceived superstitious usage, it was condemned by the Chinese Communist Party, and the planting decreased in the 1950s. But then with decollectivization and in the current migration context, it became an attractive crop again, because the income obtained from this crop is more than the double than that from rice, or at the time of my research. And these spongy cores that you see here, they are sold either locally for cushioning coffins, for funerals, or they are exported to other Asian countries to make tatami mats. And this cash crop is very popular on the one hand because it needs very low input of farm chemicals, which also makes it much cheaper to cultivate than rice, but also because it needs much less labor. And this makes it an important crop for elderly people whose bodies are no longer strong and who lack the support of others. And in contrast to the cultivation of lampreash, the processing, what you see here on this image, is highly demanding because you need to peel each individual stalk separately and to remove the core without breaking it, which is not easy. And this was a 70-year-old left behind woman I call Granny Lee. I cut off the head now for privacy reasons. But she was particularly good at this, and the other family members gathered around her. Most of them, they were not able to do this, to peel this rush. And she sold one bundle of these peeled lampreash for 3 yuan at the local market, which was then also used to line coffins. Yeah, it's very interesting, this crop, as I said, because there has been a shift on the one hand from the labor-intensive peak seasons of rice farming to a much more balanced need of labor throughout the year. Then, on the other hand, from the outside of rice farming to the inside of processing of lampreash, and third, also from heavy to light labor. And these actually match the ideal gendered spheres of knowledge distribution in rural China, which normatively differentiate between male heavy outside work and female manual inside work, as, for example, Francesca Bray and Tamara Jacka have shown. Yeah, so lampreash not only provides more income, but it's also a good crop because it also grows in a wet field like rice, which means that the field in a way remains suitable for wet rice cultivation. With other dry crops it doesn't. And it taps the potential of the labor and skills of senior family members like Mrs. or Granny Lee. And this switch to cash crops has generally been often seen in the framework of market liberalization, of because it generates more income. But my case also shows that, I mean, while profit is obviously also a very important concern, but so is also the social organization of farming in a migration context. Yeah, so I find it very interesting that you can look at the fields and then actually read from the materiality of the field, I mean, what kind of social situation is behind that. So if you see, for example, a field cultivated with lamp brush in the countryside, then you may know that there is most likely an elderly woman behind that who has been left behind by her family members. And with this, I would like to conclude my presentation just with summarizing 3 main arguments. So first, like I said, that paddy fields really play a key role in rural-urban migration and in the everyday strategies of farmers. For example, with regard to situations of split households where part of the family stays home and part of the family migrates, but also in view of circular or seasonal migration. So a lot about the migration phenomenon in China may actually also be explained through the field issue. Then second, that ostensibly technical farming decisions are always also social decisions, and they are very closely interlinked with migration decisions and often in view of reducing labor shortages. And then third, I suggest that focusing on this intimate and often tacit interaction of farmers with their material world, I mean here of farming, allows us also to sense the specific agency of farmers. And this type of agency, I suggest, lies beyond overt resistance in the sense of James Scott, but it manifests itself in very mundane, everyday practices, like of farmers engaging with their fields, whether they do so directly by farming them or also from afar by sending home money. And many of these strategies are actually in line with state expectations, so farmers don't always act against the state in the decisions they take, but I still would suggest that they follow their own projects with these strategies. But precisely because this agency, as Jan Douwe van der Ploeg has called it, resides in the fields, being deeply immersed in the material and in the everyday, it's very easily overlooked. So, I suggest to conclude that we really need to pay more attention to the material world and also to related knowledge and skills.